on debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues, we've been tasked with considering the merits of Bill C-7 as an amendment to the suicide provisions of the Criminal Code of Canada. As a privileged, white, able-bodied woman, my impulse is not only to support this legislation, but to expand it. I believe that healthcare professionals seeking to assist patients who have chosen to end their suffering should be protected against criminalization. Yet, when I examine Bill C-7 through the lens of the experiences of those who do not have our privilege, including those within my own circle and my own family, the troubling reality of far too many unanswered questions and discrepancies emerge. The Legal Committee heard testimony from those seeking non-end-of-life medical assistance in dying from places of privilege who have benefited from all of the safeguards, the resources, and opportunities to live as they chose and want to end their suffering surrounded by loved ones in an idyllic setting, invoking images of champagne and sunset river vistas to which too many others do not have access. We heard testimony from incredibly kind, compassionate MAID providers, but how can we ignore the reality that they exist within a system that has repeatedly, particularly during this pandemic, been revealed as rife with systemic discrimination? From witnesses during committee hearings, the release of reports and investigations in British Columbia and Quebec, the realities in long-term care institutions, especially those operating for profit, as well as the research of our colleagues like Senator Boyer and the first-hand experiences of Senator Bernard. We know too many in our health systems triage in ableist, racist, sexist, and other intersecting ways that exponentially discriminate. We also heard from those whose suffering is neither fatal nor inevitable, but rather the result of inadequate income, health, and long-term care supports that leave people institutionalized, isolated, and exposed to indignities. How and why are we choosing to ignore the consistent critique of national, provincial, and regional organizations that have for decades been the catalyst for our understanding, recognition, and protection of the rights of people with disabilities? Not to mention the authoritative voices of 2 UN Special Rapporteurs responsible for disability and extreme poverty, and an independent expert on the human rights of older persons. Or scholars and experts whose lives and life's work have focused on history, ethics, philosophy, sociology, race, culture, and economics through the lens of disability and the role that ableism plays in shaping law and policy. Or doctors and lawyers and people with disabilities themselves, including those who live in poverty or in the shadow of colonialism and racism, or who have been institutionalized against their will. How can this testimony not weigh heavily on our minds? Each and every one of these witnesses revealed that although discrimination, particularly ableism, class bias, and racism is rampant in our social, economic, health, and political systems, if you do not experience it directly, it is almost, in fact, it is essentially rendered invisible and therefore easy to deny. Why, despite the Accessibility Act commitments to examine all government legislation through a GBA lens, a gender, race, and disability, was the job of doing this left to witnesses and organizations whose resources are stretched so thin during a global pandemic? Despite committing to leave nobody behind, why are we ignoring witnesses who explained how removal of the end-of-life criterion for medical-assisted death relies on 3 ableist assumptions? First, that the suffering that arises from a medical condition is substantially different from other forms of human suffering, so different as to warrant an exemption to the Criminal Code prohibition on assisting suicide. In other words, that death should be a choice for persons who suffer from a medical condition, but not for persons who suffer for other reasons, even if that suffering is intolerable to them. Second, that the debate about Bill C-7 can be properly decided without reference to history, racial, social, or economic context. Third, that as long as the law gets out of the way of liberty, autonomy can be expressed freely and equally by all persons, regardless of their position relative to the social determinants of health. In other words, that offering a new choice that will clearly benefit persons who have privilege and authority will have no adverse effect on persons who do not. Why are we constructing death as a benefit for those with disabilities? What does that say about the value of their lives? As lawmakers, are we accurately interrogating our own ableist fears and biases? Why are we not ensuring that intolerable suffering, whatever its nature, should warrant economic, care, or other supportive interventions? The UN Human Rights Council has signaled that our refusal to consider this bill in the context of a stark history of abuse inflicted on persons with disabilities, often under the guise of mercy or protection, amounts to an ableist rigging of the debate. They have asserted that the compelling rhetoric of choosing a death with dignity will prevail in this debate if and only if, to paraphrase Gabrielle Peters, we persist in flattening the, quote, us that is Canadian society to white, wealthy, and non-disabled, end quote. We have heard that when people are forced to live without income, food, or safe shelter, without necessary medication and equipment, without access to communication, without access to crucial supports that have permitted many Canadians to carry on with relative comfort through a global pandemic, and without opportunities to participate, contribute, to be seen, and to see themselves as having value, that in these very real and present circumstances, death, either by suicide or by MAID, will be and is being chosen in the absence of other relief. How is this anything but a fundamentally ableist formulation of choice? How, as these realities of systemic discrimination against and exclusion of persons with disabilities remain uncontested and irrefutable, can we support removal of current safeguards? In October, the Supreme Court of Canada reminded us that differential treatment can be discriminatory even if it's based on choices made by the affected individual or group, particularly where choices are constrained by systemic inequality. Abstract notions of choice, absent concrete realities of inequality, mean that we risk conflating equality with choice. It is assumed that if we have freedom of choice, we have equality. But this is backwards. Equality is the prerequisite for choice, not the corollary. Unfortunately, as we are witnessing here, choice is not generally effective as a sword on behalf of equality claimants, but is frequently employed as a shield against equality claims. By emphasizing the idea of individual choice without accounting for the fact that individuals will have unequal options to choose from, Bill C-7 stands to expand rights for some at the expense of increasing inequality for others. As we debate Bill C-7, is in whose name and in whose interests are we acting? At the same time, the minister testified to the legal committee, reassuring us about the scope of consultations with affected parties. BCANS, an organization representing Indigenous peoples with disabilities, without the privileged platform of a committee hearing, was online tweeting about the lack of adequate consultations with Indigenous peoples and persons with disabilities. These groups have characterized the government's consultations as an exercise in being drowned out by more well-resourced individuals or excluded altogether. Bill C-7 has been described as a law for those who are well but worried, well off, and white. How many of us in privileged places recognize that we would not want to live in the kind of long-term care home we have too often seen deliver horrific neglect, isolation, and suffering, particularly during this pandemic? By failing to adequately fund, set health, economic, and social spending standards while prioritizing the expansion of medical assistance in dying, a massive cost saver for the government, has the government reneged on its commitment to uphold the Charter, international obligations, and forgone its commitment to end poverty and to ensure recovery for all? Honourable colleagues, I have listened carefully to all, and I have endless respect for the sponsor of this bill. But I find these realities beyond disquieting and query whether this is the legacy we want to leave for those who do not enjoy our relative privilege and opportunities. Honourable colleagues, I thank you. Merci, miigwech.